Right now in the U.S., about 70% of the population has had at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. So we know that some people have decided not to get vaccinated no matter what. But then you've got others who are still on the fence because they're unsure of what to do. So when you have so many different opinions, one thing becomes clear. And it's that trying to convince a loved one, a friend, or a stranger to get vaccinated can get kind of ugly. But listen to this. A local doctor says that doesn't really have to happen. Dr. Edward Brodkin, he co-wrote the best-selling book, Missing Each Other, How to Cultivate Meaningful Connections. And his tips are based on what he calls cutting-edge neuroscience. And he's got a pretty good idea as to what can make a conversation regarding vaccines go south. Now, Dr. Brodkin is with us now. He's an associate professor of psychiatry with the Perelman School of Medicine at Penn, and he joins us now. Thank you so much for being here, sir.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Dr. Brodkin, you say that the first step in opening a discussion when it comes to vaccination is to be non-judgmental and to listen. Could you explain a little bit more?
Sure. When we're trying to convince a friend or a relative to get vaccinated, our first instinct might be to just say, just go get vaccinated. There's so much evidence that this is helpful. But when someone is vaccine hesitant and they're on the fence about vaccination, if they feel like they're being told what to do or being lectured at, sometimes that can lead them to put up a wall or put up defenses, and they just stop listening to you. So sometimes really the best way to approach your friend or relative is to start by listening to them instead and saying, how are you feeling about vaccination? What are your thoughts? What are your feelings? And then really try to genuinely listen to what's on their mind in a fairly non-judgmental way. And also maybe ask them about what questions they have about vaccination.
Okay, this is really good because that leads me now to my next question, which you suggest that you then ask the person for permission to share with them some of the information that you've learned about the vaccination. So you kind of do a reverse thing there where you listen to them first and then you ask them if you can share some info with them. Why does that work?
Well, first, by doing that first step of listening, and genuinely listening to them, you open up a space of dialogue. So when they see that you're genuinely listening to them, they in turn may then be more likely to listen to you and be willing to hear from you. And so with that second step you mentioned, if you then ask them for permission and say, would you mind if, would it be okay with you if I were to share some information I've learned about vaccination or even some of my own experiences, and they give you permission, then again, they're more likely to listen than if you just dive in without their permission.
So one thing that you also suggest is to use the power of attunement. What does that look like?
The power of attunement, the ability to tune into another person and yourself and the connection between you. So that's really what we've been talking about so far. It's opening up a space of dialogue. It's being willing to listen and hear the other person's perspective and their point of view, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, or even if you think in some ways it might be mistaken. A willingness to do that, to listen, again, opens up that connection.
So, okay, we talked about neuroscience and these tips, or you talk about that. What makes you think that this advice that you've just given us is going to work?
Yeah, it sounds good, right? But the next question is, does it really work? And the reality is there's a lot of evidence out there that it does work. There's been many years of research on this. It's this approach to talking to people in the clinical world, in the world of doctors and other healthcare providers, is called motivational interviewing. And there's a lot of evidence that motivational interviewing approach is effective in increasing rates of vaccination. Doing the full motivational interview method may involve clinical training, and it may be beyond what most people have been trained to do. But I think using these fundamental principles of this to start by asking the other person what their thoughts and feelings are, to listen to them, to foster a rapport and a connection, I think can really help.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And it also sounds like being patient and also knowing on your part that if you're trying to be the one convincing, that it might also take some time, right?
Exactly. This may take more than one conversation. Now, I realize that time is of the essence right now. We're in the midst of a surge of the Delta variant, and so we really need people getting vaccinated as soon as possible. So hopefully, if it takes more than one conversation, you can arrange to have that second or third conversation fairly soon after the first. But sometimes people may need a little bit of time to think it over, especially if they're quite hesitant.
Okay, but what happens if there's a fight? If things get nasty?
Maybe you caught them at a bad moment. Maybe they're feeling irritable for some other reason. Maybe you're going to be best off reapproaching them at another moment. There are other kinds of fights, I suppose, that you could get into that may be more in the midst of the conversation. But I think it's best to try to not get into a shouting match in a fight, because I think that's generally not going to convince the other person. That's generally going to just make them harden in their position.
Yeah, that never really works. Dr. Brodkin, thank you so much for your advice. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.